Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Rethinking Possible, a Memoir of Resilience, by Rebecca Faye Smith Galli. Narrated by Tavia Gilbert. Prologue. What's planned is possible. All the love we come to know in life springs from the love we knew as children. Unknown. We were 5, until we weren't. Our world was orderly and predictable, until it wasn't. We knew so much about love, laughter, and the joy of being family, until we didn't. I remember one Friday night meal so well, especially my prayer, the one that still haunts me. It was summertime, and we'd been preparing for weeks. In 1964, I was 6 years old, and I thought I knew everything. I was the rule follower and vigilant enforcer, in charge, or so I thought, of my 4-year-old brother Forrest and my baby sister Rachel, who was 3. After each trip to the grocery store, we would watch Mom set aside 1 or 2 items for the beach box, a sturdy cardboard box she tucked beside the refrigerator, far out of our reach. Saltines, Peter Pan peanut butter, Mount Olive dill pickles, and 2 boxes of Life cereal filled the front, while the special treats, Lance cheese crackers and Little Debbie oatmeal pies, were mostly hidden near the back. Our plan was to head out before daybreak the next morning for our annual 2-week trip to Myrtle Beach. My siblings and I colored as we waited in the den for Dad to get home. It was almost time for dinner, a family staple you could set your watch by. 6 o'clock was the usual magic hour when all outside distractions were turned off, put up, or otherwise silenced so we could share an uninterrupted family meal together. We knew no other way to dine. That night was a special dinner, a clean-out-the-refrigerator breakfast-for-dinner meal, eggs, bacon, grits, and gravy. I watched Mom's shadow dart back and forth between the stove, refrigerator, and sink. Then I heard a pop. "Canned biscuits tonight, guys," I whispered. "Don't say anything, Ray." I shot a look at my sister, her blonde pigtails swinging back and forth with each stroke of her crayon as she hummed, "Oh, my darling Clementine." She stopped coloring and returned my look, a slight smile curling at one side of her mouth. "She won't." Forrest interrupted our standoff and moved in front of our sassy sister to see if he could get those mischievous green eyes to lock onto his soft blue ones. "Will you, Ray?" "But homemade biscuits are better." She peered beyond Forrest to rest her impish eyes on me. "And I don't like canned biscuits." And the Battle of the Sisters, another family staple, began. "Yes, you do," I said. "No, I don't." "Yes, you do, Ray. You eat them all the time." "No, I don't." She pounded her fist on the coloring book. "Homemade biscuits are better, and you know it, Becky," she fired back, far too loudly as she jutted out her chin and crossed her arms, jamming her fists into her armpits, her posture of defiance I knew too well. "Shh," I hissed. "Mom's going to hear you." True to our southern roots, canned biscuits were the exception in our household, but this fight wasn't about biscuits. "Your mom makes a mean biscuit," Dad said each night when a fresh, hot homemade batch was passed around the table. Canned biscuits were a rarity, but if served, we were never supposed to mention it. "Mom works hard to get that dinner on the table. Let's be grateful, not critical," Dad would remind us. Apparently, Rachel hadn't learned that lesson, so of course I had to set her straight. She could hurt Mom's feelings if she complained, maybe even ruin dinner. "Everything all right in there?" Mom's voice cut through our bickering. It wasn't her chocolate voice, the one that was anything but sweet. That rich, dark growl let us know we were in trouble for sure. This time it was only her warning voice, louder than normal to drown out the iron skillet's sizzle, but still sharp and melodic, with the last syllable emphasized for attention-getting effect. "No unpleasantness," she crooned, her shadow darting faster. "You kids know better. Your father will be home soon." "See," I whispered, jutting out my chin in my own defiant posture. Dad called Rachel Little Bit because she was the youngest and small for her age, but there was nothing little about her ability to stir things up. We could count on her for that. "Remember, Ray, we are going to the beach tomorrow. The beach." Forrest gave her shoulder a gentle squeeze, and then widened his eyes. "So we should eat what we have. They may not be the best, but they're still good, right?" Ever the peacemaker, Forrest had presented his case. Rachel looked down at her scribbling and studied it. "Well, okay," she sighed, unfolding her arms so she could start coloring again. Forrest smiled at me, and I grinned back in approval. "Hey, Ray, you smell that bacon?" I said, trying to lighten the mood and unify the troops. "We love bacon, don't we?" Forrest and I both nodded encouragement at her. "Yes, we do," she replied, and finally smiled, beginning to hum again. We'd done it. Forrest had helped her focus on the good, while I reminded her of what we all loved and could look forward to. Together, we'd ganged up on our sister to get her to behave, a dynamic we would continue, until we were no longer 3, and we couldn't. "Dinner!" Mom called, motioning us in as she primped her hair and pulled her bright red lipstick from her apron pocket. "Your father's coming up the back steps." She touched up her lips and quickly blotted them with a tissue, stashing both back into the pocket before running her tongue across her front teeth and checking her smile in a knife blade's reflection. Then she looked at the 3 of us, searching our faces. "Is everyone happy?" "Yes, Mom," we said in unison. That's what mattered. Happiness was a premium commodity in our household, right up there with family time, gratitude, and planning. And Mom was the master of happy. She looked it, lived it, believed in it, and faithfully promoted it. But happiness took work. We each had to do our part, whether preparing the dinner table or settling our differences. I shot Rachel another look, trying to raise one eyebrow like Mom did when she meant business. Then Dad burst through the back door into the kitchen and announced, "I'm home." "Daddy!" we squealed and jumped on his neck, his Old Spice aftershave lingering despite the end-of-day stubble. His jet-black hair hadn't moved, slicked back into place with that little dab of Brill cream. He kissed Mom hello while we still clung to his neck. Old Spice and Brill cream, the smells of the 60s, of safety, of my larger-than-life father, the anchor of our family. At 6'3", my lanky, blue-eyed minister father towered over all of us in both presence and charisma. He had a flair for the dramatic, both at home and at work from the pulpit. Well, actually anywhere he went. With little effort, he commanded the room with his booming voice, broad smile, and eyes that seemed to look into your very soul. "Are we ready for dinner?" he asked, his deep, refined tone playfully mocking the hodgepodge menu, even though it was a family tradition. Any meal can be a special family time with the right attitude, and Dad always knew exactly how to spin it to make it special. We each took our place at the table, immediately holding hands. Thank goodness the biscuits were beside Dad and the bacon was beside Rachel. "Becky, I believe it's your turn to pray," my father said, nodding and shooting me a quick look, one of his signature pulpit moves he used to direct the service. Mom concurred with her approving smile and matching nod. No one could take a bite before we said amen. It was important to be thankful, even for canned biscuits. I started my standard "God is great, God is good," but just before my amen and our customary hand squeeze, I took a short breath and added, "And please, God, let nobody die during the next 2 weeks." "Becky!" my parents exclaimed, both forgetting the hand squeeze. Rachel's and Forrest's eyes popped open, their jaws dropping in shock. So surprised they were that I'd apparently done something wrong. "Well, isn't that a good prayer?" I asked, raising my voice a little higher and thinner, hoping for an angelic tone. "I just want folks to stay real healthy for the next 2 weeks. If someone dies, it'll ruin our vacation. Dad will have to come back to do the funeral." Although I don't recall the exact response, I'm sure I received a lengthy lecture on the purpose of prayer. Even so, I thought I'd hit the right mix. I'd blessed the food and let God know what was on my mind, just in case he forgot. Regardless, I still hated funerals. They messed up my plans. Funerals were the kind of thing I worried about as a PK, a nickname for preacher's kid that I didn't like much but accepted. PKs, like doctors' kids, have to deal with being on call, emergencies, and the reality that other people's problems become our own in a split second. Although I grew up in a household of faith, where flexibility was a requirement, I didn't like the 3 Ds, death, divorce, and disease, intruding on our family plans. These life-changing events were just a side effect of my father's job, a routine yet necessary nuisance. I cringed now at the thought of that foreboding conversation, the selfishness, the shallowness, the way I discounted others' tragedies. But then I remembered that I was only 6 years old, and it was a gutsy prayer. At least I was honest. Later that evening, all 5 of us gathered for the pre-packing meeting. Dad rattled off each item on the checklist, and the kids took turn hollering, "Check," as Mom looked on. "Great job, guys," Dad said, kneeling down to give us each a hug. "Faye, I believe your children have their ducks in a row." "We do, Daddy," I said, and turned to my siblings. "What do we say, guys? What does Daddy always say?" "What's planned is possible," we said, just as we had rehearsed. And we knew this plan by heart. We knew next would come packing time, Dad's artful but systematic way of stuffing every nook and cranny of the large trunk of the Ford LTD. "Lay it all out," he would soon instruct so he could size up the load. "Luggage here, beach chairs and sand toys there, books over here." And we would litter the driveway with our memories in waiting. We knew the alarm would be set for 5 a.m. the next morning, but that Rachel would already be up by then. We knew she would wake Forrest and me, like she did every morning, but this time we wouldn't mind, since the earlier we left, the sooner we would get there. We knew Dad's study time would fill every morning while we played on the beach with Mom. We knew around noon we'd meet Dad back at the house for lunch. We knew he'd come down to the beach for 20 minutes about mid-afternoon. "I don't really like the beach," we knew he'd say when we begged him to stay longer. "It doesn't like me," he'd say, since he burned so easily. "But I love it because you love it." Then he'd kiss us each on top of our heads and go back to the house. We knew Mom would cook every night except for Thursday, when we would go to the Calabash for seafood. We knew we'd have to come in early from the beach that day to avoid the gosh darn beach traffic and the cotton-pickin' long lines outside the restaurants, although that was precisely how we judged the good ones. We knew we each would have a vote in what restaurant we finally selected, although Dad could be mighty persuasive if one struck his fancy, or he had the inside scoop from one of his friends. We knew we would be seated in whatever restaurant we picked no later than 5 p.m. After all, that was the plan. We knew Mom would get the flounder and Dad would get the 2-choice combo platter, shrimp and oysters, please. We knew Forrest and I would get just shrimp, no slaw, but with extra hush puppies. And we knew Rachel would get a cheeseburger, plain, no mayo, mustard, or pickles, since the juice ruined the taste of the cheese. But before we would even get in line, we would have checked the menu posted in the window to make sure they served cheeseburgers, since, well, it was a seafood restaurant. We knew Forrest would order iced tea without ice. We knew the confused waitress would say, "Excuse me, sir, did your son say iced tea with no ice?" We knew Dad would explain that Forrest thought that ice diluted the flavor of the tea. Then Dad would joke that Forrest must have ancestors from London. Who else do you know orders iced tea without ice? Then he'd rub the top of Forrest's shoulders and tell him, "That's all right, son. The Brits are a fine lot." And pull him closer to say, "It's okay to march to the beat of a different drummer." We knew if Rachel were in a precocious mood, she'd complain, "Why does he order tea that way? It takes too long." Then add, cutting her eyes at me, "That's stupid." Then I would tell her that she was the one with the stupid order. Who gets a cheeseburger at a seafood restaurant anyway? Even though secretly that burger looked pretty good, especially since I really didn't like shrimp. I only ordered it to please Dad and be like Forrest. And then Dad would say, "Now, girls," with his deep, stern voice, and I knew that she'd done it again, got me in trouble when she's the one who'd erred. Then Mom would lift one brow and say softly in her public scolding voice that we had been unkind to one another, unladylike, and plain. And we would get up right then in the middle of the restaurant to apologize and hug one another as instructed. But squabble or not, we knew when the order of iceless tea came, Dad would ponder the tea bag and its life of extremes, how we boil it to get it hot, and then ice it to cool it down, how we make it sweet with sugar, and then make it sour with lemon. Forrest and I would listen intently, even though we heard the story each time we went out to a restaurant, and Rachel, predictably, would roll her eyes. But before the food came, we knew Forrest would beg at least once, "Dad, tell one of your jokes." Dad had so many we thought he should number them, so we would only have to call out the number. But instead, he'd give us a few options, and then usually tell them all. We'd all laugh hard and long, but we knew Forrest and Mom would laugh until they couldn't breathe, and sometimes cry. Most of all, we knew we would have a great time, a highly anticipated expectation we exceeded every summer for 14 years. Until we couldn't. "What's planned is possible," my father taught us at an early age. "Got to get my ducks in a row," Mom said at least daily, as she showed us how to plan your work and work your plan. Set goals, focus, and achieve them, I learned. Our family, individually so different, was united by lessons and traditions that were meant to last a lifetime. But sometimes, the best-laid plans simply aren't possible. Chapter 1. The Accident. We are shaped and fashioned by what we love. Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. 14 years later, Sunday, September 3rd, 1978. The grill was still hot, smoking after the third batch of burgers for our Labor Day celebration. The smell of freshly baked brownies had lured some of us inside. I knew some of the kids, but had been invited by a friend of a friend to an off-campus apartment I'd never visited before. I was 20 years old and had just begun my junior year at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I was looking forward to that sweet spot year, comfortable with college expectations without the senior year pressures of figuring out what's next. The phone rang, interrupting the banter of our casual reunion. "Hey, Becky," my friend hollered from the back of the kitchen. "It's your dad." "That's weird," I mumbled as I excused myself from the group, leaving a lone brownie perched on the side of my paper plate. I wonder how he found me. I was at an obscure off-campus apartment. It was 1978, so there was no call forwarding, custom greetings, or leaving messages. An uneasy tightness started twisting my stomach before I even said hello. "Dad?" "BB," Dad began, using his pet name for me. "There's been an accident," he said, and then swallowed hard. "Your brother's been hurt." "What?" I whispered, sucking in air and information as my knees bent and I slumped to the floor. "He was waterskiing on Lake Hickory and hit the edge of the pier," Dad continued in a steady tone. "He hit his head. We are moving him to Winston-Salem. He's unconscious." His voice trailed on with information that I heard but could not process. The words stalled outside my ears, unable to break through the disbelief. Forrest. An accident. Waterskiing. Hit his head. Unconscious. Going to another hospital in Winston-Salem, an hour and a half away. "But he's going to be okay, right, Dad? He's going to be okay," I stammered back to my father. Forrest had just come to visit. I just gave him a haircut. I just borrowed his leather-trimmed jeans. We wore the same size. "He's stable, BB, but this is serious." Stable, but not okay. Coded words. Dad was so solemn. Usually he was optimistic, hopeful. He could find the good in any situation. But this time I could not get one positive word out of my father. More words and questions pulsed across the wire. We pieced together a plan. I called my boyfriend, and he agreed to drive me from Chapel Hill to the hospital in Winston-Salem. Mom, Dad, and Rachel would meet us there. I drove back to my apartment, threw a few clothes in a bag, and waited on the steps for his arrival. I'd never heard Dad's voice so grim, so unwavering, so haunting. I squirmed on the brick step and traced my finger along its edge, letting its rough but firm pattern attempt to stabilize my spinning mind. But it was no use. All I could think about was my precious family. We were more than a family of 5. We were 5 RFSs, we were proud to point out. Robert Forrest Smith, Jr., RF, Ruby Faye Smith, Faye, Rebecca Faye Smith, Becky, Robert Forrest Smith III, Forrest, Rachel Fern Smith, Rachel. Dad would kid us that it took him quite a while to find a woman with just the right initials. After 2 years of marriage and miscarriage, I was born. 2.5 years later, Forrest was born, with Rachel joining us only 17 months later. At one point, Mom had 3 kids under the age of 4. We had a busy, active household. As a family, we shared more than our initials. Sit-down breakfasts and 6 o'clock Southern suppers punctuated our daily routine. Mealtime conversations focused on our schedules, school happenings, current events, and opinion swapping about everything from the latest movies to the current congressional race. My siblings and I were well schooled in all aspects of family life, void of the typical gender limitations assumed at that time. Rachel and I knew how to wash a car, mow the lawn, and check the oil in our cars. We would spiral a football, sink a free throw, and hit at least a double on the softball field. I wasn't much of an athlete, but I was still a competitor. In another dinner-time blessing, I prayed for my team to beat Rachel's in basketball. Again, Dad tried to help me with that purpose of prayer conversation. "BB, you should have prayed for the best team to win." "But Rachel has the best team," I said matter-of-factly. "And I want to win." Forrest, a 3-sport athlete with exemplary sportsmanship, knew how to fry a pork chop, set the table, and thread a needle. We all knew how to make hospital corners with our bed linens, clean a toilet, and jumpstart a car battery. My father's grandfather, Papa Benfield, was a minister, as was my father's Uncle Nolan. When Dad felt the call to the ministry, both men gave Dad the same advice: make sure to spend time with your family. The needs of the pastorate can be all-consuming. They were right about that, as my childhood prayer attested. Dad took their advice. As soon as they were married, my parents decided that sundown Friday to sundown Saturday would be reserved for the family. Once they had children, Friday night was date night, and Saturday was reserved for the family. Picnics, sports, cookouts, and special outings with each child. I loved spending time with my family. My parents were bright, funny, and always in motion, learning and teaching. When I turned 13, when all my other friends were complaining about their parents, I remember secretly wondering what I was supposed to rebel against. Our family was close by design. My stomach still churned as I tried to reconcile Dad's strange voice with what lay ahead. I glanced at my watch and decided to go back into my apartment to grab a few packs of Lentz cheese crackers and a couple of Cokes, staples I always had on hand. I sat back down on the step, opened a pack, and took a bite. It was an odd but reliable comfort food, helping me get through more than one all-nighter, and a few hangovers. That familiar crunch and nutty taste reminded me of those Saturdays long ago when Dad would take me to the Esso filling station, where his buddy Rex would fill up our car with the weekly allowance for gas. Dad would buy a pack of Lance and a Coke for me for $0.25. It seemed so extravagant at the time. I would munch on my crackers and sip on my Coke, enjoying the salty sweetness, while I listened to Dad shoot the breeze with Rex. Dad would ask him about his service station business, his family, and then tell him a few jokes. Dad could talk to anyone about anything, it seemed. Whether in the pulpit, at a gas station, or hanging out in my college dorm room, he peppered his conversations with timeless stories, as well as knee-slapping jokes. My friends loved him. "Glad you got to see me, girls," he would boom to my college buddies before he heel-clicked and saluted goodbye, leaving them perplexed. He nicknamed everyone, often to help him remember names, which was so important for a minister. "How are you today, Miss Sarah with an H?" he would ask. "How's it going, Junebug?" he'd quip. "Good morning, Patricia," he would announce, as if he were at a horse race and she were the winner. And to really throw them off balance, he'd ask, "How are you prognosticating?" with the face of a straight man waiting for a punchline response, which again was usually another puzzled look. "Your dad is a hoot, the funniest minister I've ever met," my friends would tell me. Occasionally, someone would try to cash in on Dad's heavenly connections and ask, "Can you help us out with the man upstairs and arrange for some good weather for tomorrow's football game?" "Sorry," he'd reply without blinking. "I'm in sales, not management." I thought about that role as I took one last bite of my cracker while my boyfriend pulled up. I threw my bag in the back seat, jumped in the car, buckling up my seatbelt. And then I wished with all my heart that Dad was in management. My boyfriend Carter lost himself in his tunes, as he liked to call them, singing along to Hotel California. Our bumpy 2-year relationship was at a good place for the moment. Carter was a scholarship athlete, one of the captains for UNC's wrestling team. We'd met our freshman year. When I told him about Forrest's accident, he borrowed a friend's car to drive me to the hospital. I don't remember talking, only thinking. Detailed thoughts, distracting thoughts. Untouched by hardship, neither one of us had much to offer one another. At age 20, how could you possibly know what to say to help? We were in foreign territory, so I let the radio's blare fill in the chasm for the 90-minute trip to the hospital. The sharp edge of Dad's voice still rattled me. Then I thought about Mom, his perfect companion. I was sure she was right by his side, as usual. I cut my eyes to glance at Carter. Perfect companion? Not so sure. I wondered if Mom and Dad had any bumps in their college days. Maybe we only heard the storybook version. Mom, Ruby Faye, was the oldest of 4. Her other siblings similarly named, John Ray, Robert Clay, and Pearl May. Her mother called the girls, Ruby and Pearl, her little jewels. Mom's father died, leaving his wife with 4 children, ages 8, 7, 6, and 5. Because of the financial situation, as Mom used to explain, the children moved to an orphanage in Kinston, where Mom stayed until she received a scholarship to attend Wake Forest University in Winston-Salem. There she met my father. I flipped the visor down and adjusted my sunglasses. The glare of the open road hurt my eyes and my heart. Winston-Salem. Mom and Dad met there. I was supposed to go to school there. And now Forrest is in the hospital there. The city that held so many memories, so much promise, now terrified me. I let the shaded warmth of the sun slip my mind into more reflections about my family. My childhood seemed distant, yet present every day. What made us so close? Although love and laughter ruled in our home, expectations were high. We were the first family of the church, with 5 pastorates that had ranged in size from 500 to 2,000. I couldn't remember a time when I didn't feel like we lived in a glass bowl. It wasn't uncomfortable, just a fact of life. We were often tutored on what to say.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?